Guys, what a treat today. Disney and Pixar's new movie Inside Out 2 comes out June 14th, and today we are going to go way behind the scenes and visit with one of the two psychologists who were consulted for the movie. Her name is Dr. Lisa Damour, and I'm so excited for you to hear this conversation as we march through things like joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and of course, anxiety. Now, just in case you only have 5 minutes to spend with this podcast right now because you got to run to a meeting or to work or whatever life is dealt you rather, I want you to hear this part where we talk about anxiety and she really shakes this out. Have a listen to this and then we'll get into the entire podcast.
No. So anxiety, and it's so perfect that she comes on the scene now when Riley's turned 13, because what anxiety is it allows us to anticipate threats. So fear is, that's the threat right here, right in my face. Anxiety is, what could go wrong tomorrow? What could go wrong later today? Or I haven't studied for that test that I have tomorrow, and so I can anticipate that I need to be anxious about it. That capacity to project forward, to imagine things from lots of different sides, comes online for kids in adolescence. Comes online around 13 or 14. Suddenly there is the ability to see things through new dimensions, imagine oneself in the future. Prior to 13, kids are pretty concrete in their thinking. Like, where I'm at is where I'm at, and what I think is what I think, and that's probably what everybody else thinks, right? I mean, that's sort of how younger kids operate. And so fear and anxiety make such a good team because fear is, there, and anxiety is tomorrow's test. And so they're both valuable. And you are 100% right. You're supposed to have anxiety. Anxiety is also protective. I care for teenagers and I say to them all the time, if you walk into a party and you get the sense that this thing is kind of out of control and you get anxious, that's a good thing to pay attention to. You should probably go home, right? Don't start drinking to make the anxiety go away, because what you're anticipating is like, this feels a little out of control. This could spin very out of control. I can now imagine that. I should probably go home. So anxiety is protective. And the way we've messed this up though, Matthew, as clinicians, is that we recognize anxiety to be a typical and healthy emotion. And then we also use the same word to describe disorders. And so that's, I think, on psychologists. It's on us for messing that up. So it's very easy to tell them apart. And I'm going to tell you the difference. So healthy anxiety happens in response to a threat that one can anticipate and is in proportion to the threat. So I'm worried about the test I haven't studied for, and I'm just anxious enough to get going. Unhealthy anxiety shows up when there's nothing wrong, right? The work is done, all is good, or is way out of proportion to what's wrong. So maybe I haven't studied for the test, but if I'm having a panic attack, that's not helping me. You'll see in the movie, this all gets taken care of and worked through in the most useful and gorgeous way.
Find and learn from people who lived it, wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from people who lived it.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
I don't know how we got so lucky. I don't know how we got so lucky today, but we are in for a treat. Dr. Lisa Damour, who was born in Denver, same city as my son, who was born in Denver, now lives in Ohio, and she's got an accolade list that doesn't even fit on the screen. But one of the things that we're going to talk to her about today is her involvement in the new movie Inside Out 2, which is coming out June 14th. And for anybody that saw Inside Out 1, myself included, I can still tap into that feeling that I had watching that screen. And I was like, yes, this is what we need. This is what we need. More people talking about this stuff, and especially in this way where it's easy, it's digestible, I can make sense of it. I could leave that movie theater understanding my own emotions better, which will only help me in my own personal life. So that's a long way of me saying welcome to our podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today, Dr. Lisa. Thank you for being here.
I am so happy to be here. This is all we're going to do is talk about my favorite subject, which is feelings and teenagers and movies. So it's wonderful.
And me too. I'm more
Yeah.
and more in this space because I just know in my heart, because I've seen the transformation in myself. When I decided to take a really close look at myself, spiritually, physically, mentally, and make the changes that I needed to really step into myself, I couldn't believe how much freedom was sitting there on the other side of that work. And if there's anything I want to press upon people, it's that when you get a handle on emotions like joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and now anxiety, which will show its face in this new one, you really have an opportunity to turn your life around. And I don't think either one of us are going to sit here and suggest it's easy, but what we're saying is that if you can get a few tools, if you can work on a few things, you really can improve the quality of your life. And so I want to start with this question right here, Dr. Lisa Damour, which is how does somebody get wrapped up in a movie like this to begin with? What an
I know.
amazing honor.
I know. That's exactly what it is. Huge honor.
Yeah.
So, I'm a psychologist. I have always worked on adolescents. I love teenagers. I have a lot of thoughts about my own adolescence and how that plays into this. And so I started practicing about 30 years ago. And then about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I was like, there should be a book about typical development in adolescent girls, because there's all these books for when things have gone wrong, but not a book that explains the sort of bumpy road that is expectable.
Okay.
So I had written books on the academic side. So I wrote a book called Untangled, and it
A
published.
New York Times bestseller, by the way.
It was. And this book, even though it is actually coming up on being 9 years old, still sells 1,500 copies a week. It has got a life of its own. And what it really speaks to is people need help with just the typical unexpectable, that there's just not a lot out there about, what to expect when you're expecting a teenager. So that book published in 2016.
Sorry, but that made me think of the book that we read when we were having a baby called What to Expect When You're
Exactly.
Expecting.
Exactly.
Right.
And you just need another one later in development. So I wrote that book, and then 3 years later, I published a book called Under Pressure: Confronting the Epidemic of Stress and Anxiety in Girls. And I also started writing for the New York Times, was writing a lot for them around teenagers. And actually, in 2015, my editor sent me to write about Inside Out. And I'd never had a press pass before. I'm a psychologist, and I took my then, I think she was 13-year-old daughter. She's now 20. Yeah. If we do the math, I've probably gotten the math wrong. She must have been 11. Oh, 11, and Riley was 11 in that movie. So I took my then 11-year-old daughter, who's now 20, and we went and we saw this movie. And then I stayed up all night to write my piece because I had to turn it around right away. And I just, what you said at the beginning, I just praised this movie to high heaven because of what it was doing around normalizing distress, welcoming emotions in, talking about them as important parts of our lives. So I'm chugging along, loving Inside Out, doing my work on girls, doing my work on adolescents. And then in 2020, I got a call from Pixar in May of 2020 asking for a meeting. And we get on the Zoom, right? This is all at, the start of the pandemic. And there is Kelsey Mann and Meg LeFauve, the director and the writer, holding Untangled and Under Pressure, my two books that I had written up to that point, or my commercial books.
Wait a second. Hold on. Slow down.
Yeah.
Were you like, what is my life right now?
Yes, this was a total pinch me moment. I was like, are you even kidding me? And they have been so phenomenal. The entire Pixar team has been so phenomenal to work with now for 4 years. So we started a conversation that day about anxiety, about girls, about development, about adolescence, and got right down to business in that conversation. And then we've just kept in touch and had gone back and forth. And I've gotten to see screeners and, give feedback. And I remain, I'm sort of, it's like a little bit like I'm adapting to it, but I remain as excited and joyous about getting to do it. And I'll also tell you, Matthew, I've had really good luck in terms of my work getting pickup. I've now had 3 New York Times bestsellers. I have a podcast that's really well listened to called Ask Lisa, The Psychology of Parenting. I will never be involved in anything that has the reach of this movie. And just in terms of what it means to me as a clinician who wants to help as many people as absolutely possible, the invite to be part of this, even in the smallest way, like, I feel like I could retire.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there it is really quick, just so people can see it. That's the podcast she was just referencing. If you want to check that out, please be our guest. I'm sure it's fascinating. And I love the Ask Me Anything kind of style of podcasting anyways. I think it's a cool thing because there are questions as a professional that you're getting every single day. There's probably 15 of them that happen all the time. And it's a great opportunity for you to just kind of sequence through that all the time. Because one of the things that I like to share with people, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, is that when we're going through tough things, when we're experiencing sadness, anger, fear, disgust, anxiety, some of the things that are going to show up in Inside Out 2, we have a tendency to think that we're all by ourselves, that nobody else is going through this but us. And if you just open it up and you look at the pure statistics, like, you can see you're factually completely incorrect. There's millions of people that are battling these same things day in and day out. And I don't know if you feel this way about the movie, but I feel like it's an amazing conversation starter, because as a family, you could go see this movie and then you could go home, and with somebody who's got a decent level of awareness, you could have some pretty incredible conversations with your kids that might make adolescence a tiny bit easier, no?
100%. Okay,
Yeah.
you're right on like 40 levels. So let me break this down a little bit. So
Okay.
one thing I can tell you is that in the 30 years I've been working, I can tell you parents of teenagers almost always feel quite isolated.
Sure.
And the reason for that, right, is that the kid that they felt they knew and understood suddenly changes, becomes much more reactive, much more emotional, much less pleasant sometimes around the house.
Yes. No, that's truth. I'm living it now.
Yeah, and the parent's like, "What happened and what's wrong with this, or what's wrong
Yeah.
with my kid, or what's wrong with us?" But when you've got a kid who's 12, 13, 14, you're not gonna, like, start asking everybody, right? You know, if your 3-year-old is having a hard time with potty training, you can bring it up at the playground. But
That's
if your
it.
13-year-old is being a complete, kind of salty kid all day long, you don't feel as ready to bring it up. So I think there's always been a great deal of isolation for parents of teenagers. I will then say, in the time I've been working, the discourse has shifted to much more fear about how adolescents are doing. And you cannot right now get away from headlines about adolescent mental health crisis, adolescent psychological distress, very frightening and intense and persistent messaging about teenagers being at risk, fragile, worrisome. So into that moment comes this movie. And what I love about this movie is that, first of all, it will reduce isolation for parents. There is this terrific, terrific scene early in the movie where out of nowhere, Riley gets like super mad at her mom, like super mad, like just, and just like this overnight shift that we do see in adolescence. For parents to get to see that and to think, okay, it's not just us. It's not just us. This is adolescence. So first of all, it will reduce isolation. Second of all, it normalizes intense emotion and negative emotion. And the thing I am most uneasy about the current cultural moment we're in, especially for teenagers, is that psychological distress is being equated with a mental health concern. You and I know those are not the same thing. Psychological distress is being human. It's definitely being a teenager. And so for this movie, as you described, it's entertaining, it's engaging, it's funny, it's compelling, to also be a course correction on that messaging, on the idea that if your kid is upset, something's really wrong. I can't actually voice the level of gratitude I feel for Pixar making this movie right now.
Yes. Yeah, it's really critically important. And I love that you use that word fear. And I think that comes from, I know this comes from a place where we're just starting to get more comfortable with all of these emotions. We're talking about them more. They're showing up in more places. We're actually calling things what they are. And it's new territory for a lot of people. And especially if you grew up in a home like mine, where maybe thoughts, feelings, and opinions weren't always welcome, you're going to bring that stuff into your adult life and you're going to keep operating the exact same way. And so I want to take us down a little bit of a journey, if you don't mind. In Inside Out 2, there are a bunch of different emotions that are represented: joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and anxiety is the new one. And so I want to start with that because it is really one of the words that we're starting to say a whole lot more. And I like what you just said about, like, just because you're anxious doesn't mean that you're mentally ill and there's all this wrong with you. And we need to start pushing medication and we need a psychologist right away. Some of those things can be true, for sure. Some of those things can be true. But by and large, we're just flowing through life and we're going to get anxious. We're going to be joyful. We're going to get angry. We're going to have some fear. We're going to have some disgust. We're going to get sad. And that's just part of the journey. And so what I want you to speak to, if you don't mind, is your point of view on embracing the flow of emotions versus the balancing of emotions. I have a terrible time with trying to balance things because I just don't think it's really feasible, but flow is really possible. So give me your thoughts, feelings, and opinions about flow of emotions, especially as it relates to adolescence.
I agree with you. I think it's actually hard to feel two things at once, right? I mean, we talk about ambivalence. That's probably as close as we get. I do think you feel one thing right after another. And I think, even in my clinical training with caring for little kids, that's how I was told to talk with kids about feelings. You feel this and then you feel something one right after the other. You don't feel them all simultaneously. That's, like you say, not very feasible and certainly hard to describe. If we start with this premise that you're embracing and that this movie embraces and that I wish the whole culture would embrace, that emotions are natural to being human, even the uncomfortable ones, and we're going to feel them as we move through our day. If we accept that premise, which really right now is a stretch in the culture, but it is absolutely the true thing, then we can actually take a very, very valuable view of our emotions as data. They are feedback. They are telling us how things are going. So if you are walking down the hall at school and you get anxious because you see a kid coming who you know is mean, that anxiety is protecting you. It is telling you steer clear of that kid. You can reasonably anticipate, based on experience, that you don't want to involve yourself with that kid. If you interact with somebody else and you feel hurt, that's data. It's saying, pay attention to how that person treated you. Use that going forward. So psychologists are surprisingly agnostic on emotion. We don't prefer positive emotions over negative emotions.
Good. Thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. And the best analogy is physical pain, right? Nobody likes physical pain. Physical pain serves a purpose. It tells us we are injured. It tells us to get our hand off the burner. Same thing. If every time you interact with somebody, you feel completely lousy afterward, that's good information. Your job is not to try to find a way to feel better. Your job is to tune into that discomfort and make a change. And so if we welcome this idea that all feelings belong, they happen one right after another, they're giving us a constant stream of information, and we treat them as data points, that's what helps us live our lives in a wiser way.
Can I pause you really quick? I want to talk specifically about something you just said. It's like some people stay in a bad situation and they try to talk themselves into it. Well, they're just having a bad day, or, this was just a really weird moment because of this. And we tend to do that. We tend to validate when we don't feel good ourselves. We try to find all these reasons why we don't feel good. And I love what you just said. And when I speak in front of audiences, I say the exact same thing. I'm like, pain is sent to you as a signal, nothing more than just a signal. So you'll do something about it. And that's such an important thing for people to know. And so when you're talking to adolescents, especially teenage girls, which I know you specialize in, I'll bet you have to work that out a lot of like, hey, your feelings are really valid in this motion, in this particular case. And if somebody's making you feel that way every time you're around them, that might be your cue that they're not supposed to be somebody that's in your life for a little while. And I'm always careful to use that language, right? For a little while, because not everybody has to disappear forever, but some people need to get the hell out of chapter 5 and come back in chapter 9, right? Like that is real. So how are you advising parents and adolescents to deal with the when it keeps showing up and yet they still really won't do much to change, or I don't want to say fix it, but change the situation?
So this is a very interesting clinical moment when I'm caring for a young person, often a girl, who's in a not great relationship, right? And is telling me about the downsides of the relationship or being treated poorly or, those kinds of things. Because of course, as a clinician, I want to be like, get out.
Right.
Stop dating this person. What are you doing? But there's two things that we know. One, clinically, we don't tell people what to do.
Sure.
The other is you don't tell teenagers what to do, because teenagers, by their nature, if you tell them what to do, they're going to want to do the opposite. And I love this about them, and I accept this about them, and I very rarely say anything critical about them. And I don't even know that this is critical. They are designed for independence. And so by their nature,
Amen.
and I wrote about this in Untangled. I had this fantastic, I love them all, this fabulous, very, very tightly wound, disciplined, I think she was a high school junior who I used to see on Friday afternoons. And she came in one day at 4:00 in this terrible mood. And I'm like, what's up? She's like, oh, my homework has been all over the dining room table all week. I had an hour before our session. I was going to clean it all up and put it all away. I was so looking forward to it all day. And I walked in the house and my mom told me I had to clean it all up and put it all away. So I spent the hour I was going to do that fighting with her about how I wouldn't do it. She's like, and I'm so mad because it's not done. And I was like, oh my God, I love you. And this is adolescence. So you can't say, dump them, right? You can't do it. But what you can do, and this actually is true for adults also, but especially true for teenagers, is you can reflect back to the fact that they have a conflict, that that they're at odds with themselves. So one long-winded way to do that is to say, you're telling me about all of the, ways in which he hurts you, or the ways in which, this person leaves you feeling really crummy. What's getting in the way of you moving on, right? So asking like, what's getting in the way is a very powerful way to do it. If I want to get to it a little faster, I will say something like, what's a smart girl like you doing in a relationship like this? And that instantly makes an alliance between me and the smarter part of this kid to try to figure out the other part of the kid who is staying in the relationship. One other way to go at this, I love like the technical aspects of psychotherapy.
Me too. This is so good.
Okay, one other way to go at this is, I've used this often, I will say, look, you're telling us about all this stuff that's not working. You wouldn't stay in this relationship if there was something that was working for you. Tell me about that part. Often when you get that on the table, they can start to see movement. But when they tell you the bad stuff and then you're like, well, why are you hanging out with them? They're like, well, you don't get it. So you're like, help me get it. And then you'll decide what you want to do.
And isn't it important to note and say and articulate that a lot of times, not just kids, but us adults, we tolerate situations based on our upbringing. So we all have this relational programming that we come with based on what we've seen, heard, tasted, and touched along the way. And if somebody's putting up with a bad relationship, it could be that they've had that mirrored for them or modeled for them in their own life. And they think that's what it is. And so to them, it's like you're coming to them and you're like, hey, why are you in this relationship? And they're like, what do you mean? This relationship's great. It looks just like the one my mom and dad had growing up. And I'm always fascinated by the answer to the question, how do you help people who don't even see it understand it?
It's tricky. And I'll tell you a corollary in my training is you can't answer a question that hasn't been asked.
Yeah. Okay.
So, right. I mean, I think that that's one of the hardest parts about being a clinician is that you have to use restraint, right? I mean, that the person there is your client and it's their therapy and they're going to bring up what they want to work on. Yeah. So when you're going to bring up something that is not on their radar, you have to be very, very mindful about how you go about it. There are ways to do it though. So you're totally right that often when people find themselves in relationships that are not so good for them, it's a replication of a pattern. And so one way to go at it is to say, I hear what you're saying when you describe this treatment. And I also hear that it's familiar. Like it's this, right? And there's comfort in the familiarity. And then you can say, but I'm not sure it's actually how you deserve to be treated. Yeah. Right. So you can't just go at the like, dump the person.
Right.
Now, the other thing that you can do, and this is also true in terms of past experience is that sometimes people do stay in these relationships because they do feel it's how they deserve to be treated. And that has to be surfaced. And so you can say something, and a lot of it's in the tone, a lot of it's in the approach of saying, what makes you think you deserve this kind of treatment?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that asking that question, for which they may not have an easy answer, calls it, right? Says like, nobody deserves to be treated like this, but you're allowing it. What's this about?
Huh. That's such a great way to get inquisitive. One of the things that I like to say to my boys is they're going through tough things. And I'm like, do you need me to help you work out what words that you could use to express this to other people? Because that's what I'm good at. I'm good at, listen, I've been a blabbermouth my whole life. I'm good at talking. I'm good at communicating. I'm good at choosing words and putting them in together. And so I feel like that's a skill that I can help out with. And there's been several times where they've just been dealing with something because they didn't know how to address it. They just didn't know what words to use. And I think that's so common. There's a lot of people who sit in a space where they don't know what the heck to do, but they don't know any better about how to get themselves out of it. And so there's a question here somewhere, which is like, how do you guys as psychologists, and how does this movie help people kind of become aware of these emotions so that they can start doing something about them?
Gosh, this is like my favorite conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. So by way of framing, a good psychotherapy provides choice, right?
Yes.
That's the outcome of a good psychotherapy. Things that felt like they just were what they were, or there was no other way, suddenly loosen up, and there's a sense of choice. So I could stay or I could go, right? And that's it's not that the clinician tells the person what to do; it's that the clinician helps the person have choices. Okay. To your question about how this ties in with the movie, sometimes people's sense of choice is limited because they're frightened of emotions, right? I can't leave this relationship because I won't be able to take the pain of losing this person.
Okay.
Or I have to stay in this job because I'm too afraid of looking for a new job. And it's pain or fear that traps people where they are. So back to what you said about emotions coming one right after the other. One of my favorite moments in my training, I have such a vivid memory of this day sitting with my supervisor. Actually, this is sort of like a funny little side note. It was my supervisor, is a woman. This was, literally 25 years ago, actually more than that. Kelly Novak, brilliant psychologist, the daughter of Gene Kelly, the dancer. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she was my supervisor when I was in graduate school. And I remember one day we're sitting in supervision and she said, we have the strangest of all jobs. Our job is to help people get deeply in touch with their emotions, really feel things, really get to know their feelings, and then to say, and it's just a feeling. You can withstand it.
Yes.
And so in terms of this movie and helping people free up their lives, for these emotions to be embodied as characters that are one of many, that come and go, that pop into the scene, pop out of the scene, that are often funny in their way, right? Brings them to a size that is exactly what they should be, right? Important, valuable, informational, protective, not in charge. Part of the team.
It's so, we don't say it enough because most people haven't been down the road all the way. And it's this idea of how much value do you give these big T's and little T's in your life? And so many times, and I'll just use a personal anecdote of myself. So when I was 23 years old, my father had a heart attack right in front of me. And I tried to save his life and I couldn't. And in that moment, what wrapped up for me, at least from a belief standpoint, Dr. Lisa, was that I didn't know enough and I couldn't be useful. And I took that operating system into my career. And I didn't, it didn't show itself all the time. And I think this is true for a lot of people. It doesn't always show up. But what I like to say is that it showed up enough and when it mattered. And that's what I think is the big difference there. And so then when I went through my training and all of my therapies and all of my awakenings, what I ultimately had to come to grips with was let me put it like this. We're all carrying these suitcases and they weigh 50 pounds. But what you need to understand is if you want to keep carrying that suitcase, that's fine, but empty out all the stuff in it because you don't have to carry the weight of it any longer. And when you can set down the weight of it, now you're free. Now look what's happened. You've opened up the suitcase. There's nothing inside of it. So there's room for what? There's room for more. There's room for more things to be put inside this suitcase. And so I want you to maybe take us on a little bit of a journey there because we all have things that have happened to us, but how do we untangle the web from your vantage point and stop giving it so much value so that it just shackles us? Because one of the most important things I heard in my training was we are all the elephant tied to the plastic chair. And I love that thought that at any moment, any one of us could get up and walk away from where we are. It just feels like we can't. We're like, I'm tied to the chair. I can't move. It's like, no. You're an elephant. Get up and walk. That thing's coming with you.
You have choice. You have choice. You have choice. Yep.
Yeah. So comment a little bit about, when things happen, how much value we give them, the importance of letting go of that and being able to move on.
Okay. So there's some things that happen that rewire the nervous system, right?
For sure.
Capital T trauma rewires the nervous system. And that's really how we make a distinction between that and little t, upsetting events. So moving on from upsetting events versus capital T trauma, like it just looks different.
Sure. Okay.
And so if it's capital T trauma, it's much harder because your nervous system has been rewired by those events. And it takes time and it takes good therapy and it can be done. Okay. Then there is just moving on from things, whether it's capital T or little t, or just, any variety of events. Another one of the sayings we have in clinical work is that things are so much more frightening on the inside than they are on the outside. That if you carry something around privately and secretly, a belief about yourself or a fear, and you don't share it, it has outsized power over you. As soon as you say the words to somebody, right? I believe, like what you said to me, right? I had this belief that I didn't know enough and I wasn't useful enough. This is where we come up against a little bit of magic almost. As soon as that goes from being an internal, privately held belief to a shared, it's on the table between me and another person, I can't tell you how this happens, but we know it does. It diminishes in its power. It is now in the light of day. It shrinks it. It makes it a thing out there that I can talk about, look at, share, walk away from, come back to. It's not inside of me secretly, taking up all this space. And so what you talk about in terms of like putting stuff down or unpacking it or getting it out, for me and for clinicians, that's psychotherapy or that's language. And it doesn't have to happen in the context of a therapy. It can happen in the context of a wonderful friendship.
Right.
Saying the words, moving things into language has like truly a magical force in terms of making things more manageable.
And it works the other way too, right? Like let's go to the emotions that are going to be, kind of profiled in the movie, like joy. When you're joyful and you're in a great mood and you express joy, what seems to happen in your life? More joy finds you. It's really cool. It's really cool. And here's the other thing. If you're experiencing anger and you're pissed off all the time, take a look at the people that are going to be around you. I bet you got a lot of angry folks around you. Like, it is incredible how much value there is in cycling through the emotions, because as you said a few minutes ago, they're all here to give us information. They're all here to tell us what's going on. And our job isn't to decide whether it's good or bad. It's just to acknowledge that we're receiving some information and then make a choice on whether or not we want to do something different with that moment. And so can I ask you to take us on a little bit of a journey? We're going to walk through each one of these emotions. What is the up and the downside of joy? Is there a downside, but what is the upside to joy?
So joy just feels good, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a wonderful,
good.
It feels good. And there's value in that. And like you say, it brings people close. It also, like all emotions, it's feedback. It's like, do more of whatever you're doing that just gave you this feeling, right? There's value in that. Now, in Pixar's depiction, and I love this, and this was true in the first movie, and it comes back in the second, the downside is joy, as the character, doesn't want the negative emotions to have too much say, like wants to have Riley be happy. And as you know from the first movie, that first movie is actually about there being more balance and sadness being of enormous value. And I'm trying to remember the headline that was put on my article that I wrote for the Times, but it was something like Pixar's joyful argument against childhood happiness, I think is what I called that, my
Okay.
piece about the first movie. So
Yeah.
joy is fine so long as joy is not trying to banish everything else.
There it is. Right. Because you can't be joyful all the time. That would be, let's just be honest, that'd be exhausting.
Yeah, not possible.
Yeah.
And also, like, it's funny. I think a lot about, like, there's so much pressure for happiness and joy. And I've
Yes.
really tried to notice, I'm like, well, when do I have those experiences? Because I have a really nice life. I really, enjoy many things. Even still, like, they are fleeting. It's like I have a moment where I'm like, oh, my whole family's home and we're all at dinner, right? And like
Mm,
I'll have like a, and then you do the dishes, right? Or
that's right.
like I love riding bikes. I'm from Colorado. I was riding up and down a mountain last summer, and I had this like kind of elated feeling, but then it goes away, And so I think at best, joy and happiness, like they come, they go, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and I love to kind of harp on this point a little bit because what you just said is so true. We live in a world where everybody's like, think happy thoughts, be positive, and my message is always like, man, listen, if the what just hits the fan, you don't have to be positive about that moment.
That'd
But
be weird. That'd
what
actually
you
be weird.
might yeah, right. What you might want to do though is explore neutrality. You might want to explore how you can be more neutral in the moment to not give it all of the weight that it needs. And again, that gets me back to my way of thinking, which is, hey man, just let this flow through. Like
Mhm.
stop trying to control this thing right now and just let it flow through you. Let yourself feel it. Let it do all the things. Sadness. That's the next one that I want to cover here on this. And yeah, let's dive in. Your thoughts and feelings on sadness and its worth and its value.
So sadness, if we had to sort of say what it comes up around, it's usually around loss,
Yes.
right? And it's either my dog died, or I didn't get the job I wanted, or I wanted to be captain of the team, or, it's like something's missing that we wish we had, or something has left that we wish would stay. And what it does is it helps us attach, right? We want to have connection to things. We want to feel a part of things. We want depth in our relationship. And sadness reminds us of how much that matters to us, to be meaningfully connected to other people. And sadness also helps us honor what it means to lose somebody.
Yeah. I'm closing my eyes because you don't know this, but I just lost my mom April 1st.
I'm
And
really sorry.
yeah, it's all really fresh and still like I'm still walking through those moments of sadness, obviously. But
Yeah.
gosh, what you just said is so important because it does. It reminds us of what is important sometimes. And then when we see it in front of our face, it's like, you know what? I should probably choose that right now because I know what it feels like when I don't get a
Yep.
chance to have that. Okay.
Yep.
What about fear? That one's a big one. That might be its own podcast.
Yeah, no, fear is a very primitive and very valuable emotion. It keeps us safe.
Okay.
Fear is the emotion you have when you are in danger. Fear is bear. Fear is swerving car. Fear is, and it activates us. It is uncomfortable. It does not feel good to be fearful. It's supposed to be uncomfortable because that's what helps us to pay attention. Fight or flight response, right? I mean, that is what fear is for. It is there to keep us safe.
Right. Yeah, right. And then disgust. That's a word you just don't hear very much, but
No.
I'm really happy it's a character in the movie. Like I instead of disgust, you could have probably chosen like shame or something like that. But disgust is a good word. What does it mean for you?
So, the first movie had 5 and the new movie has 4 new ones who come in. So it's a team of 9, which is very appropriate for a 13-year-old who, Riley is in this movie now. So disgust, and they did such a good job choosing the 5 for the first movie because in many ways they're like the most basic or rudimentary emotions. And the value of disgust, you're right, we don't talk about it that much. The value of disgust is if you think about emotions from an evolutionary standpoint, like, and fear is very easy to think of from an evolutionary standpoint. Like if you didn't have fear, you did not make it, right? Your genes did not survive to come into
Right.
they
Yeah.
did not get passed down. Same with disgust. That sense of like not wanting things that are rotten or nasty or gross, if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, that's actually protective, right? Like if you had no disgust or no sense of things being repellent when there was something really wrong with them, you would do things or ingest things that you shouldn't be involved with. And so disgust is a wonderful example of an emotion that is ancient and protective. Like they're all protective in each in their own way.
Then there's anxiety, the new one of the new ones that shows up here in orange. I love it.
It's just great.
Bright orange, looks like an old like comic book character. Great look about anxiety. Anxiety too is not always terrible.
No. So anxiety, and it's so perfect that she comes on the scene now when Riley's turned 13. Because what anxiety is it allows us to anticipate threats. So fear is, that's the threat right here, right in my face. Anxiety is, what could go wrong tomorrow? What could go wrong later today? Or I haven't studied for that test that I have tomorrow, and so I can anticipate that I need to be anxious about it. That capacity to project forward, to imagine things from lots of different sides, comes online for kids in adolescence, comes online around 13 or 14. Suddenly there is the ability to see things through new dimensions, imagine oneself in the future. Prior to 13, kids are pretty concrete in their thinking. Like where I'm at is where I'm at, and what I think is what I think. And that's probably what everybody else thinks, right? I mean, that's sort of how younger kids operate. And so fear and anxiety make such a good team because fear is, bear, and anxiety is tomorrow's test. And so they're both valuable. And you are 100% right. You're supposed to have anxiety. Anxiety is also protective. I care for teenagers and I say to them all the time, if you walk into a party and you get the sense that this thing is kind of out of control and you get anxious, that's a good thing to pay attention to. You should probably go home, right? Don't start drinking to make the anxiety go away, because what you're anticipating is like, this feels a little out of control. This could spin very out of control. I can now imagine that. I should probably go home.
Yeah.
So anxiety is protective. And the way we've messed this up though, Matthew, as clinicians, is that we recognize anxiety to be a typical and healthy emotion. And then we also use the same word to describe disorders. And so that's, I think, on psychologists. It's on us for messing that up. So it's very easy to tell them apart. And I'm going to tell you the difference. So healthy anxiety happens in response to a threat that one can anticipate and is in proportion to the threat. So I'm worried about the test I haven't studied for, and I'm just anxious enough to get going.
Yeah.
Unhealthy anxiety shows up when there's nothing wrong, right? The work is done, all is good, or is way out of proportion to what's wrong. So it may be I haven't studied for the test, but if I'm having a panic attack, that's not helping me. So you'll see in the movie, this all gets taken care of and worked through in the most useful and gorgeous way.
I can't wait. June 14th, this thing comes out, and I don't take in the theater very often, but this will be a movie that we go see in the movie theater together. And I just want to wrap by encouraging everybody that's listening to us right now, who might be, because I think a lot of the folks who choose my podcast specifically are new-ish into the mental health and wellness space. Maybe they are here because of a friend's podcast, or they're here because of a title of a podcast, and they're like, yeah, me too. I feel some of that too. What are they saying about that? And I just want to encourage you guys to use this movie as such, and we said it earlier, such a useful tool to open up dialogue in your own family. Because I know for a fact that we really, really, really want to be amazing parents to our kids. The best thing we can help them do is understand these emotions, articulate these emotions, and not be afraid of these emotions. And we get to choose as their parents what that safe space looks like. And if you don't know how to open up the discussion, a movie like this does it for you. it's all right there. You probably have 15 things that you could come home and discuss. And so that's going to be my last question to you, Dr. Lisa, is after you see this movie, what's one good thing for families to go home and talk about?
So probably the most universal, if you have a teenager, is social media being a big part of kids' lives. And when we worry about kids on social media, one of the things we worry about is social comparison, that they're looking at other kids and feeling like they don't measure up. So one of the new emotions is envy. And I was thinking about this the other day. I was like, man, one giant takeaway for everybody with teenagers is that they can now use the presence of envy as a character in this movie to have a really good conversation with their teenagers about what it's like to look on social media and see people who seem happier, fitter, richer, whatever, and feel envy in response to that. And I don't know that that's a conversation that families are having right now. And it's a wildly valuable one because we want kids to actually be questioning what they see and noticing their reaction and not just taking it in whole and wanting to be more and more and more like what they see online.
I love that so much. And again, envy can be used in a good way too. I remember, and I write about this in the book that I'm writing right now. I remember being in 7th grade. I was dating this girl and I went to her house for the first time. And I don't know, Dr. Lisa, what her mom and dad did for a living, but they lived in the biggest house I had ever been in my entire life. They had the basketball court and the pool and the volleyball court and all this crazy stuff. And I remember in that moment going, I didn't even know this was possible. I want some of this. And I know that's the little switch that turned for me. I can go back to that moment driving down that private drive as being the driver for me to want to be successful in my own life because I saw what was possible. I had a little envy there.
Yep. And it can go in good or bad ways, right? And that's a good way to go. Like it's going to inspire you sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where it can be useful. If you see somebody that looks better than you on Instagram because they have a better physique, well, I don't know. You have an opportunity to go try to get that yourself. Now, be careful because if you don't get there, you don't want your value and stuff to suffer. But yeah, it's like everything. Joy and sadness, anger, fear, disgust, anxiety. They all have their goods and their bads. And as we've been talking about in this podcast, your job is to not give it so much weight so that you don't feel like that's the whole game for you.
Exactly.
Yeah. What a fun chat. I feel like we need to do more of these because there's so many follow-up questions that I wanted to ask you today. We'll get that in due time. You are a busy, successful woman, and I'm very, very grateful for your time today, Dr. Lisa.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It, wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.
Healthspan MD is a high-quality primary care and cardiology practice. That means expert, available with the best customer service in healthcare, combined with a proactive, whole-person approach to discover your best opportunities to take charge of your health. And we accept insurance. Get the healthcare that increases your health span by visiting healthspanmd.com.